Hello and welcome. This brief recording is an overview of the content and the reasons why we've put the Thrive Toolkit together. I'm going to talk to you about this by way of looking at the introduction to the Thrive Toolkit, which is probably a pretty good place to start. Why have we put the Thrive Toolkit together? Well, it's because a lot is talked about mental health in the workplace, and that is very, very important. But we feel and we know that the needs of survivors of childhood trauma are often overlooked. Survivors of childhood trauma feel shame in the workplace, as well as those with mental health problems. However, the shame of being a survivor of childhood trauma is such that quite often you will find survivors hide behind a mental health label in the workplace. Perhaps it's because it's preferable to bear the stigma, if there is one in your workplace, of mental health, rather than disclosing that you have needs as a survivor of childhood trauma. And the needs of survivors really do go beyond the mental health label. So, in the introductory section, as you can see, there is an overview of childhood trauma and mental health. It's not chapter and verse, it's just a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of some of the salient points in the workplace. As I say, if you take on board the needs of survivors of childhood trauma, you will be working towards a comprehensive mental health solution. And this toolkit can either stand alone, or you can use it in conjunction with other resources that you might have in your own workplace. So the first thing is an overview of the impact of childhood trauma and mental health. The impact of childhood trauma can last a lifetime, and this document gives you some indication of what the issues are. We also have a document here called a definition of childhood trauma. Now that's quite interesting because childhood trauma, as you can see written here, is often described, or really more recently described, as adverse childhood experiences. That term is possibly more useful. It has come over from the States, and what it means is that you can say to yourself, actually, children experience quite often more than one type of abuse. So here we have the definitions, and when you have a look at this document on your own time, you will see that there are 4 areas of childhood trauma: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. But going back to this definition here, or this phrase here, adverse childhood experiences, is useful because it tells us that if children experience more than one type of abuse or adverse experience, they're more likely to have severe and long-lasting impacts across a range of health and emotional difficulties as they are adults. So the main message in the introduction is about the lasting impacts of childhood trauma for many survivors. We talk also about the impact in the workplace and in working life, and here you will see things not just about the mental health issues, but also some behaviours that you might recognise, and these could be conflict, it could be hypersensitivity, it could be mistrust of individuals, of people, especially in authority figures. You'll also see that we've got a little interaction here about survivors' voices, and that's where survivors talk about the impact of their problems in the workplace, and sadly how employers actually lost out because they either resigned or they lost their jobs. We also have, just go back down again, we also have a section to be complete in this overview about mental illness. What is mental illness? And here, this is With this little icon here, you can see it's more of a presentation, and it just gives you an overview of mental illness and well-being. One of the important things throughout this toolkit, and that is worth mentioning at this stage as an overview of our approach, is that we want to move towards a comprehensive solution. As I said earlier, childhood trauma goes beyond a mental health label, but of course mental health is important and has been very well perceived as a strong business case for tackling mental illness in the workplace. But here at Thrive, we also want to join some dots. What does that mean? That means we don't want to see mental illness in a silo, because actually a lot of people who have physical problems do have a mental health problem, and vice versa. In fact, we're talking about 46% of people. So we feel sometimes there is a danger in talking about mental illness that we just look at it in a silo. So we need to consider physical health as well. The other point, of course, that's relevant here from the point of view of childhood trauma is that the impact of childhood trauma on health, as in this document you can see, means that we don't only have long-term psychological problems, we also have a full range of physical health problems that are positively correlated with experiencing childhood trauma, especially things like cardiac disorders, fibromyalgia, chronic pain, respiratory disease, and so on. Another issue is that you probably have a domestic violence policy in the workplace, and if you don't, there is some information about that within the toolkit. But just to say that survivors of childhood trauma are much more likely to be re-victimised later on in adult life. So again, let's join the dots. Let's remember that if you have an employee who has experienced domestic violence, it is worthwhile considering that they may also be as an adult survivor of childhood trauma. And we talk about how you might approach that. Alcohol and substance misuse, again, that may be nothing to do with being a survivor, but actually, in order to dull the pain, perhaps the continuing pain and the difficulties that survivors experience, they may engage in alcohol or substance misuse. So again, let's not see people in a silo. The whole person turns up to work, we like to say. And you know, a lot of the information in the Thrive Toolkit and our approach to working with employees means that the whole workforce can benefit. So there we have it. That's your little introduction. We suggest that you do have a look at it in the toolkit. You look out at the survivors' voices. You consider issues around the impact on health. You have a look at mental health and well-being. And you also consider, very importantly as well, the Equalities Act, adjustments and survivors. There's a lot more throughout the toolkit about adjustments as well. Thank you for listening.